Our last panel of this symposium is a conversation between Dan Levenson, I will come back to his work in a moment, Anthony Salvador, who's the director of Platt and Borstein Gallery here in LA, and Daniel Spaulding, who's an art historian. He also teaches at the Art Center, and he's a prolific writer and thinker. And they're going to be talking about Dan's project that, as I mentioned earlier, and some of you in the audience got to experience it, is currently shown at House of the Book in our other campus. Dan is going to be talking about what led him into this project, so I'm not going to go into that right now, but what I wanted to share with you, since we're not in this space right now, is my journey into the work with Dan. So Dan's project also takes us back to Switzerland, but at the same time leaves us here in Southern California. Dan's project focuses on a Swiss art academy of his own invention called the SKC. Dan's practice involves creating the curriculum of the school, the physical space of the school, the works by the students. And I first came across his works in LA Contemporary Art Fair, which I think was the first art fair that I saw here in LA. And that feeling of seeing his work and then climbing up to a podium that represents where the classroom begins and being in the school was phenomenal. And when we started to work on the Orion project, I knew that that work could have great significance for this project. I just didn't know to which extent. And I'm very proud of this project. It is remarkable. I mean, I'm sorry that I'm saying those things right in front of you, Dan, but it is a remarkable project in my mind. Dan actually brought the SKZ into the space of the House of the Book, which was created, inaugurated in 1973 as a space for learning about Israeli culture and Jewish culture. Created its architecture, and you're going to see that in a few moments. Its architecture is based on Israeli brutalist architecture. So there were a lot of resonances between the way that building looks and feels and tries to trigger you as viewers and as people being there, and Orion's practice. And Dan and I started talking about bringing the SKZ into that space, and that is actually what happened within the framework of this site-specific installation. So this work was created specifically for the House of the Book. And it was intriguing to see how the interrelations of vision and exploration of space, of shape, and of lines come into play in both of these projects. I think that's all I want to say about that now, because I know you're going to be talking a lot about that, but we can go back to those connections during the QA section. So I think the only thing left for me now to do is to invite you to join us here. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to give a very brief overview of my work and the project at the House of the Book, and some of the connections between my work and this building that I chose as the site for this installation, and Ezra Orion. And then I'll sit down next to Daniel and Anthony. Yeah. Okay, so this is my studio in East Los Angeles. On the right is a desk that was one of the first pieces that I built when I moved to Los Angeles about 5 years ago. The desk is a sculpture, but it's also the desk that I use in my studio. And then on the left here are these boxes. Everything in my studio kind of doubles as studio furniture, but are also artworks, and they are meant to be relics from an art school called the State Art Academy Zurich, or SKZ, which is an art school that's completely fictional that I invented. And it's a kind of modernist art school that existed in a 20th century past, that's a kind of generic 20th century past, not a specific year, in an imaginary Switzerland. So I take some things from actual Switzerland, but generally I don't strive for any kind of authenticity. And this art school operated kind of on specific rules, and the central tenet of the art school is this curriculum that begins with a particular kind of rectangle, which is familiar to most people in the world through A4 paper, which is the universal office paper, universal size for office paper in most of the world except the United States, where we use 8.5 by 11. And this rectangle is part of the A series. It's part of the, as Anthony mentioned, it was the DIN, a kind of German set of standards, and then part of the ISO, which is this international set of standards that governs kind of everything in industry. And it's tied to the speed of light. So the painting on the wall above my desk is an expansion of this rectangle, and the area of that rectangle is 1 square meter in area, made into something called a silver rectangle. And the meter is a section of a light year. It's supposedly the distance that light travels in almost 1/3 millionth of a second. So that, I think, is one kind of fortunate coincidence between my work and Ezra Orion's. I liked this idea that the art school would start from some kind of basic principle that is universal. The light year is called the universal constant. It's the only constant that's the same throughout time and space. And if the art school kind of started with this really rock-solid principle and expanded out from there, then it would be, I don't know, somehow a good curriculum. So all of the paintings that the students do are based on dividing up this kind of very rational rectangle. And the surface of the desk is double A0, which is 2 square meters in area. So 2 of those paintings fit exactly on that desk, and so on and so forth. And then there's a pile of rags, which are actually aprons, and the aprons also are A1 size, 1/2 square meter, and the strings of the aprons are 1 meter, so I get kind of obsessive about that. The floors of my studio also I built, and they are also this rectangle. They are 4 A0 rectangles. And then the boxes are supposed to be lockers, student lockers, storage cabinets for the paintings, these student exercises that they do. And I build all this stuff. Finesse it. So this is one of the paintings. This is an A3 painting, and then the first thing I do is make a diagonal here, and then this diagonal is divided into 1, 2, 3, 6 equal sections. And then the students make these compositions. This is one of their first exercises. Here's another one with the same division of the diagonal, but it ends up in a different composition. And these are more of the student painting storage cabinets. This is the desk. It says SKZ on the side. There's a number on each piece of furniture which corresponds to which classroom in the school the furniture belongs to. And this is a postcard that was part of a show that I did 6 years ago. That was like a little kind of museum show about this art school. So the State Art Academy of Zurich. I grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So these photographs, I walked down the street, and this is the Carpenter Center at Harvard. It's their architecture and art and design building, and it was designed by Le Corbusier, and it's a really good example of brutalism, this modernist style of raw cement architecture. So I've always pictured my art school occurring in a brutalist cement building, which is really common on college campuses. It was just a common mid-century style, and for some reason flourished in this kind of institutional setting. So there are a lot of art schools that are in these kinds of buildings. And see that the top left is a ramp, and you can, you know, as a kind of citizen of Cambridge but having no connection to Harvard, It's always a kind of mysterious place to me that I wasn't really allowed entrance to. But because it's Le Corbusier, and a lot of brutalism, you're supposed to be able to walk through. It's supposed to be open, even though it's very imposing. So there's this ramp, and you can walk through the center, and you can kind of spy on the students in their classrooms doing these exercises. So I always loved that. And then this is a still from a video that I did, also about 4 or 5 years ago. This is a shot of Boston City Hall, and over it there's a woman speaking in Swiss German dialect, which I don't speak, and she's sharing her recollection of what it was like going to this SKZ and then running into one of her classmates years later. And Boston City Hall is a famous brutalist building. Some people consider it the ugliest building on earth. It also is like, it's very imposing, it's concrete, it's giant, it has this huge empty plaza out front which is unusable for anybody, but you're supposed to be able to walk into it, and it's supposed to symbolize like the openness of government. You can walk right into the bottom and have this feeling of being crushed by government. And it recurs in dreams of mine. I've had a recurring dream where I get this really exciting exhibition, and it turns out to be in the basement of Boston City Hall. You have to walk through the boiler room, and it's this like humiliation. So, yeah. So, I don't know. Yeah, brutalism has figured in my work. This is me giving a kind of performative talk at Art Los Angeles Contemporary, where I gave the history of this art school. And I illustrate the history of the art school with images that I pull off the internet. So this is me talking about when the school was built. And it looks like Boston City Hall, but it's not. I don't remember. I think this is somewhere in Europe, this building. Yeah, this is the house of the book, where my installation is. This is on HAU's other campus, the Brandeis-Bardin campus in Simi Valley. And this was built by Sidney Eisenstadt in 1974. Is that right? 1973. So I was very excited to be able to use this spot. It's been used as a film location for different sci-fi things because it looks like it was dropped in from outer space. It's been in a Marilyn Manson video, a bunch of R&B videos, but it's both like really typical of brutalism in that it's this raw cement, and it's kind of awe-inspiring. It's seems to be like beyond human scale, but it also has these very eccentric things like this weird map texture on the outside and kind of decorative elements that fall, in my opinion, outside of the scope of normal brutalism. And I figured out that this plaza here is sort of a sundial, and that if you stand at that point where those lines converge and face directly east, that a bunch of architectural elements line up with the rising sun. So yeah, Rotem invited me to do something in response to Ezra Orion, and I only know his work through images, but I was immediately interested in it, and I'm going to talk to Daniel and Anthony about that more. But here's this piece that is in raw concrete, and it seems like it's been painted over gray, which I think is really unfortunate. I think concrete, gets stained and aged over time, but brutalism, in case anyone doesn't know, takes its name from béton brut, which is raw concrete, and it's this texture of the raw concrete and the impressions of the wood mold that make it really modernist in spirit, that it's not trying to hide its material, that it's honest about its kind of humility. That's something about Ezra Orion's work that appeals to me also, the kind of humility of this stone and raw concrete, combined with the incredible hubris of making something on walls.
Where is that?
I don't know.
That's in Tel Aviv, in a neighborhood called Rozental.
Thank you.
Yeah, I haven't seen it in person. And this is at the House of the Book. I just included this because it's a good example of béton brut. You can see the imprint of the wood on the cement, which is always something that I really like. I like the fact that simultaneously makes you very aware of the material in its raw, honest form, and then you can forget about that and focus on these like pure forms, these giant circles or cubes or whatever it is. That's, I think, what interests me. So this is the installation in the House of the Book. It's a rotunda. Basically the entire interior, there's a kind of outdoor hallway, but it's mostly just that central rotunda cone. And I set up a classroom from this art school, the SKZ. And in this classroom, the students it's a workshop where they learn to make monochromes. They're all making black monochromes. And the final part of the assignment is they partner up, like you did in chemistry class, and they make these monochrome diptychs by joining the two monochromes together with hinges. And yeah, the diptychs kind of mirror the form of a book in a way, the House of the Book, and I also liked that it's a classroom. And so I made all this furniture at Rotem's behest. It's a really, really awesome space. It's just very, very unusual.
Maybe we can say that that's when you walk in from the outside where you just saw the entire rotunda, that's the first space that meets you on the inside, and you're immediately enveloped by it.
Yeah. So there's these chairs that are part of the art school. Everything packs flat. It's just made out of painted plywood. So the tables, the chairs. Sitting on the tables are these table easels that I made that also come apart. Everything sort of slots together, very much like IKEA. I like this idea of infinite expansion, which I think is also in Ezra Orion's work. And then all the rectangles, the paintings are A3. If you put two A3 rectangles together, you get A2, and so on and so forth. So that's the idea. This silver rectangle is the only rectangle that when you fold it in half, it has the same ratio of 1 to the square root of 2. That's why it was chosen as international paper size, because it can be folded or cut in half and form more of the same A series. So the giant diptych that's on the bimah there on top of that table is 8A0, which I think is 16, I always get this wrong, I think it's 16 meters square in area. These are drawing horses, which is a kind of typical piece of furniture from art school. You straddle it and you have a board in front of you, and it's usually used for life drawings in art schools. So if you took life drawing in art school, you might have had fun with those. These are, so there's 3 of these large diptychs. And everything is made to look old, which is completely artificial. All of this work is new. It was new plywood and new canvas and stuff a few months ago, and it goes, I was very interested in what Joanna was saying about asynchronicity and this idea of being out of time. And I'm always very curious about the political valence of that and anxious about it. As a total aside, there was a story in the news about right-wing nationalists in the Ukraine who invented a Jewish partisan who they claim fought on their side against the Soviets, even though they were allied to the Nazis. I may be getting some of the details wrong, but I think they invented this character as a way to try to legitimize themselves. So I'm always anxious about this idea of fabricating a past history, even though that's basically what my work does. I make these things that look like they're part of a past history that never existed. So then, last week ago, I taught a little drawing exercise for these retreat what's the name of the retreat?
Reciprocity.
Reciprocity. So we had 23 artists. 23 artists, and I taught this lesson. I taught it a year ago at the Hammer Museum for the first time, And basically I invite actual people to to be part of this curriculum that I developed for the art school that I also actually use in my studio as a way of generating paintings. So here I'm forcing them to divide the rectangle up. I teach them something, a very simple thing called a classical construction, which was compass and ruler construction, which was invented in ancient Greece as a way of solving problems in geometry without math. But it's a very strict exercise, so people always kind of, contemporary people sort of struggle against it. And then I'm wearing one of those aprons. A bunch of the students are wearing the aprons also from the art school. They say FZ on them. Yeah. That's the apron. There's a bunch of them. Oh, this is the video.
Do you want to show the clip?
Yeah, there's 2 little clips. Opposed to content. The content of a novel is that it's a love story, or it's about a war, or an adventure, or something like that. The form is the novel itself, or that it's divided into chapters, or that it's written in iambic pentameter. Same with a painting. The content of a painting is that it's a painting of a cow, or it's a battle scene, or it's something like that, or flowers. The form of it is that it's a painting, it's a certain size, and then there's different descriptors that we use. So we're going to stick to the most general formal descriptors. Meaning those are size, shape. All right, let's show that. And then after I ran them through this nightmare exercise, there was like an impromptu jam session, and a couple of people started dancing.
Yeah, this is fucking
kind of answered this in your presentation, but I just wanted to ask a really basic question, which is what drew you to Orion's work? What did you find interesting about his practice?
Well, I think my initial response was that I liked the forms, I liked the material, stone and cement. I loved the idea. Well, I won't say I just responded to the idea of this laser obelisk and the sculpture on Mars. I feel a little bit more uncertain about those 2 pieces, but I really liked what Udi said, that he was a strict universalist, and I think that that's a major theme in my work. I think that this idea that the art school was based on a universal principle, which was the speed of light, and it was it's my sort of fantasy modernism in that it's universalist, and I think that there's something about that is attractive to me, but that is also inaccessible to me.
I'm curious about you use the word inaccessible, which is seems really key, because earlier today you asked a question that had to do with irony and cynicism. There's a little bit of a conversation around that, right? And it's a sort of question whether Orion's kind of total earnestness, as far as I can tell, is accessible to us at all. And clearly, your practice is built around a sort of massive fiction, which seems, even though it's based on a kind of universalism, to only be possible in the mode of a kind of as if, in the sense that is maybe not directly accessible anymore, but is only accessible through some kind of quotation or ironization of that very kind of universalism. So I'm curious, how you're approaching Orion as, in a sense, kind of something to aspire to, but something that's not possible, and why it's not possible.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question for me. That's like a naive question that I asked Udi, and I think I asked Joanna also. And to me, the idea of shooting this laser obelisk into space is a very universalist and maybe humanist, or I don't know. It's an idea that all of humanity could be united in this common experience and a common sense of awe. That's I think a very beautiful idea that I long for, but there's obviously political problems in that it assumes that there's a common standpoint that everybody could access that experience through, when, in fact, probably about half the people on the planet are very concerned with whether they'll be able to feed their children, or things like that's fleeing from war. And, I think that's the kind of most blunt way of putting it, that he assumes that everybody has access to his standpoint.
Yeah, well, it's sort of everybody has access to it, but also perhaps, by the same measure, nobody does, right? And especially the laser project almost seems like it's a kind of almost post-human artwork in some way, where it can never be observed, can only be grasped conceptually, and if it could be observed, it would be somebody definitely not human observing it, right?
Yeah.
Well, that leads me to think of this idea that I was fascinated with, which is heterotopia, which is kind of the idea that you create an other. Like Foucault kind of talked about that as being what the mirror is. Like it's an actual object, but what you're looking at is a reflection or an image of what you think is around you. So like this obelisk is something you can't really see. It only functions in like your memory, like the thing that you can imagine. And I think that's kind of interesting because your school sort of operates in the same way, because it's not a real school, it's the idea of a school. And it's actually very concretely based on, like, I would say like the Bauhaus kind of idea, or art center where I went, like they fetishized this Swiss idea of school and learning structures, and they created this other school based off of that. And well, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but Michael Heidel's idea of the city sort of operates in the same way, or Kippenberger's MetroNet. It's like these train stations that interlink this sort of imaginative subway system across the world. So I'm curious, like, how does this otherness like function for you as an artist? Like, what has led you to create this sort of idea, and how do you feel that contributes back into your studio practice?
Well, I mean, I like the idea of a utopia that's not homogenizing and that allows for infinite difference and infinite variation. But I don't know. I lost my train of thought.
Well, to some degree, I mean, that's not what your sort of art school is doing, because it's a very limited set of formal operations that you allow. Of course, people diverge from it if they want to. But I mean, one of the things that's kind of interesting about that project is, not just the fictionality, but also the kind of double-edged nature of that modernist universalism, and whether it has sort of totalitarian resonances to it, or whether it still seems viable as a kind of liberatory model today. And I've known you for a while, but I'm still not really sure about that. Like whether what you're doing is deeply creepy,
fascist,
not fascist, but somehow very kind of unnerving on some level.
Yeah. Oh, I know what I want. Yes, that's a good question. The Michael Heiser thing.
Yeah.
I also thought that tied back to something that you were saying about nuclear semiotics, because actually the Michael Heiser city was going to be near the Yucca Mountain Waste Depository, and it just has this quality, like you said, of being something post-human or beyond, of having total disregard for humanity.
It's also,
and
but
being-
also neighbors like the Nevada test site,
Mhm.
where they were actually testing nuclear weapons.
Yeah. So it's a problem for me. I mean, I think also both the Michael Heiser thing and some of Ezra Orion's things are like very transparently phallic, and in a way that I'm sort of just aware of these criticisms. So I wouldn't ever make like a big obelisk in the desert, because it just seems too transparent. And then again, I don't know. I'm attracted to them. I don't know.
Because it's such
Those-
a macho idea to have this.
Yeah, the idea of like this phallic order of sculpture that all sculpture participates in, of being, macho and somehow aggressive.
Yeah, it was interesting that Joanna's paper brought up Giacometti, who sort of ever since Rosalind Krauss's sort of famous arguments in the 1980s has been sort of seen as undoing that phallic, macho sort of version of sculpture. Of course, he kind of ironically comes back to it in this kind of blatant way in his later work. But there's a way in which that kind of, it's an approach towards sort of a flat field in which things are kind of laid out less hierarchically. And I wondered if, the Orion sculpture field, whether that kind of weird, erotic climax kind of approach to that sort of orgasmic quality, whether that totally negates that deconstruction of traditional sculpture, or whether he's still participating in it. So it's unclear to me, because this work is fairly new to me, and it seems on the face of it very sort of neo-monumental, right? Kind of trying to do kind of obelisks, the most ancient kind of sculpture there is, right? But Joanna's paper especially kind of convinced me that there's more going on there than just that there is a kind of complexity to it. Sorry, that got pretty far away from your work, actually. But maybe a way to kind of bring it back, which is a little bit of a roundabout way, would be to think about pedagogy and what your role is in your kind of quasi-ironic, quasi-sort of kind of representational classroom that is also at the same time an actual classroom. Because you're obviously positioning yourself as a kind of authority figure in that classroom, but it's an ironized kind of authority on some level, right? So you're not just, this heroic white dude, like, doing your thing up there. It's a little more complex than that, a little more anxious, I would say, almost, if that's not pushing things too psychologically.
Well, I see it more as that I become the passive transmitter of an authority that's somehow already beyond me. So I set up these rules for myself that I am subject to. And I think that they are rules that are already in play. I mean, when you construct a building, when you do anything industrial, you have to adhere to these norms that are already in place. They're in place for a good reason, so that, things fit together, so that nuts and bolts fit together, so that windows fit into other construction material. And then the drawing exercises and the whole pedagogy are based on those standards. So, yeah, I become the transmitter of something that, it doesn't originate with me subjectively. It's not like, but then again, it does. And then, the other aspect of it is this, these classical constructions, which originated in ancient Greece, which was kind of the basis of geometry, which also, I mean, they remain to me kind of, for the ancient Greeks, they were I think, evidence of divine consciousness and our ability to somehow access divine consciousness. Because in a way, they're just weird little tricks, but they work so astoundingly well, and for reasons I think that we still don't fully understand. So yeah, I mean, I present students with these things that are kind of very inescapable, that they have no, there's no, opting out of it. Except, that in every time I do it, there's like, a certain percentage of the class that just opts out of it because that's how artists are, and they're like,
out of your structure.
Usually, I've done it 4 times now. And usually there's one student who makes like a mud pie with the paint, and there's like somebody else who just like doodles, and like, at the first time it happened I was frustrated, but now I just, that's fine, that's part of it. The problem is that I think that for a lot of artists, we think that we are completely self-created and completely free. There's a fantasy that when you become an artist, that you're not subject to any rules, and that you make your own rules, and that's part of the beauty of being an artist, and that's part of why I wanted to be an artist. It's obviously not, it's fantasy in some ways, and that we are all bound by these rules. It's not clear whether the rules are made by other humans or whether they're somehow beyond the human. That's why I think the classical constructions are interesting. And I don't know, to tie it back to Ezra Orion, I think that's the kind of problem. Like, does shooting laser obelisk into space, is that like a kind of humanist moment where everybody gets a sense of like awe and a sense of our own, how small we are compared to the universe, but also our ability to communicate that idea of our own smallness and to respond to it? Or is it something that is kind of gesture that's terrifyingly, like, not human? Like, the era of the Cold War and of the nuclear arms race had that element. I mean, were we fighting to preserve some kind of common humanity, or were we just engaged in, were we compelled by some kind of force beyond ourselves to constantly come closer to annihilating ourselves as a species? And that, I mean, that's the kind of perspective that I feel like I come from.
Yeah, I feel like those structures tend to pose questions more than state. Like Orion's structure is kind of like, it almost seems like, what if you were able to walk up those stairs and like transmit yourself to Mars? And it's more like you kind of have this educational aspect or the pedagogy in your practice. You actually put people in the situation and try and get them to think this way, and I feel like those other structures tend to illustrate that pedagogy, or like put that question in your mind somehow, either intentional or not by Orion. But it makes you also think about, and this is someone I've been trying to tie into it, is Rozental. She kind of went out to live in the desert, she created these planar pavilions, and she also kind of invites people to experience this desert lifestyle that she has with these experimental living cabins that she has built out there, like in Joshua Tree. And I always find that kind of interesting that she wants someone else to enter to her practice and feel what she feels, whatever that is, like feel that environment that she's creating. Mm-hmm. I always wondered how that functioned with her, like how that kind of enters back to her. Like, how does this also classroom, all the mud pies and like the actual people who do the assignments kind of lead back into this sort of idea that you created? Sort of my question of that.
So, can you state it?
Well, like, how does that, I can't talk to Andrea about it, or Orion about like what that brings back to them, but like, how does this classroom environment or the teaching of them, how do you reprocess those results in your practice?
Well, I've always been very interested in Andrea Zettel, especially because she has this kind of totalizing practice where she designs every aspect of life, and there's something very appealing about that, and also something, it has, like as Daniel pointed to, this sort of dark side of being totalizing or totalitarian. the idea that all of life can become art or can be influenced by art has a kind of scary aspect to it also. And it also, like I think you're pointing to, has this like self-reflexive aspect where her own project, I imagine, becomes instead of her having control over the project has its own dictates that she has to adhere to in order to be coherent. And that's I don't know the answer, but that's kind of what my work deals with. I'm not interested in representing myself as like a completely free, creative individual who can do anything. I'm more interested in addressing the question of like what rules are set up for everybody, and how do you find freedom within those kinds of rules. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. I mean, it's like an open. That's sort of like a long internalizing process that you can probably spend your entire life doing the SKZ, and then maybe never figure out why that impetus is there, but it's there somehow.
Yeah.
It's kind of an interesting thing that people enter into that way. 'Cause some people just go to their studio and paint, and then put the painting on the wall.
Yeah.
And other people just create obelisks, and other people create little living environments for other people to experience. I find that kind of the way artists sort of deal with that is kind of interesting to me. And I think also how people create these constructs, like how Art Center is essentially a fantasy based off of Bauhaus. It doesn't really work as the Bauhaus did. And the Bauhaus was actually a little bit more like almost cultish. It's like you would do meditation and everything. You would be at the Bauhaus, and you'd be living in this kind of cult. I think Black Mountain probably works a little bit more like Bauhaus did. But Art Center was like, we're just going to take these elements and teach you color theory and put you back into the SKZ and hopefully see what happens. And I think you just get mud pies.
Yeah. Yeah. Although the Bauhaus worked really hard to expel that kind of spirituality. They had, forget the name of the first teacher who taught color theory there.
Johannes Eden.
Yes, thank you. And he was a Mazdanist. He had this sort of spiritual, religious thing, and he was a vegetarian. And they eventually, I think, felt that was not in their spirit, and so they tried to kind of expel the explicitly spiritual stuff. But yes, there's a cultic aspect to it. And but yeah, that the Bauhaus and the idea of that everybody starts from some kind of common principles that were universal, like color theory and a study of forms. That's what's appealing. And then from there, people branch out into their individuality.
Yeah.
Whereas I think art education happens in a completely different way now. It doesn't, avoids any kind of, attempt at finding a universal ground, because for a lot of reasons. I mean, it's politically problematic, and it's also been completely subsumed into applied arts. I think like designers and architects and things are much more likely to do Bauhaus color theory than painters at CalArts or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, there was another part of your question.
Well, I thought you brought up Brandeis-Bardin, and I think that part of why it makes sense, part of why I think Rotem probably decided to do this here in LA, is that there's this kind of idea of escaping to the desert, which is this kind of zone of freedom, and it's also kind of a zone that is totally distinct from a human sense of scale and a human sense, or not necessarily human, but an urban at least sense of what it means to live with other people, and where you can kind of experiment with new kinds of life and new kind of formal experimentation. And of course, the huge appeal of Brandeis-Bardin and the high desert test sites is that it's 2 hours away, like it's right here, so it's a kind of accessible version of utopia, right? I mean, one of the things that's interesting about Orion is that it seems that that there was a much stronger drive towards a kind of real kind of inaccessibility or something about that, like that the way he kind of disconnected from the Israeli art world is a lot more radical than what somebody like Zettel is doing, which is still very plugged into the art world and kind of functions as a kind of like day camp for LA artists and something like that.
Yeah. If I can just say something
Yeah.
short about this. It's true about the art world, but actually he had a lot of students.
Yeah, I was gonna get to that.
So he was actually a teacher.
Yeah.
in
Mentor.
Midrash de Boker, which is about land, about living with the so actually, and also like art student that came with groups every year for like a few days to spend with him. So he was disconnected from artists, but not from people, and actually it was for him very important. So
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason why I thought that Dan's project could be of such great resonance for
Yeah.
this project.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because I just don't know that much about Orion's pedagogy,
Yeah.
and who are these people going out to work with them? I mean, where were they recruited from? Do you know? Or,
So I know that Noach Zimlist was one of the people that went there like for 6 times with him. So it was kind of groups that came to visit Israel sometimes, but also it was students in this kind of school within the Midrasha students that like teenagers that came to learn about how to work in the desert, how to work with the land.
So it's another combination of word to mouth, because there were people who came specifically to work with him as mentor and as part of his projects. People that he recruited by knowing that, you mentioned the symposia, the sculptural symposia in the desert, and that also involved bringing in people that he knew from all across Israel, but also through that those institutional connections by teaching at the school.
Yeah, so that's a great plug that into what you're doing. I have a lot of things to say. Were you going to say something?
No, I was just going to say maybe we should share some final thoughts and then continue the conversation upstairs in the gallery as part of the opening reception, and we'll have more opportunities to talk there if that's okay.
I've got a lot of stuff. But one thing that, I'm interested in is that you're in some way kind of an art historian's artist, which I hope you don't mind, kind of being told that. But there's so much referentiality, in what you're doing to 20th century modernism specifically. And one of the interesting things about Orion is how much he seems to not care at all about kind of contextualizing himself. What I get instead is that he wanted to kind of continue this sense of absolute new beginnings that was really distinctive to modernism, and which may be kind of the last gasp of that in a way, at least in the kind of U.S. Was kind of maybe this land art moment where people decided to leave New York, leave the galleries, go out to somewhere where there had never been art made before, right? Whereas your work seems to be very much about a kind of sense of confinement in a way, where there is a kind of matrix of things that you have to kind of acknowledge as kind of determining what you're doing, right? So I'm curious how you look at Orion in that way. Is that kind of modernist ambition viable at all anymore? Should it be? Is it defensible? What is your investment in that?
I have a huge investment in it. I'm not necessarily sure that I can characterize it, but it reminded me of something that Rudy said, that Ezra Orion was interested in an aspect of modernism that wanted to do something, to be the first, or to kind of pioneer, for lack of a better word. But, it's not it's a kind of spirit of the avant-garde, I think, that exists within modernism. It's not just about doing something, being the first to do something for the sake of it, like for the Guinness Book of World Records, like be the first artist to like eat 1,000 bananas, you know. It obviously has some kind of, it's looking for some, yeah, the first sculpture on Mars, I think, has some idea of the sublime in it. But I liked your question about referentiality. I've always been interested in that. It was like one of the first, when I was in high school, I went to the museum school to take summer classes. It was like one of the first kind of college level art assignments I had was to go to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and find an artwork and then make an artwork in response to it. Very much like what Rotem asked me to do. And I found an Ed Ruscha. I was like 17, I'd never heard of Ed Ruscha. And I went and made a sculpture in response to his painting. I loved that idea, and for me, that's where I locate the sublime in my work, is being part of a kind of conversation that's, like you say, that's the history of art. And even with all of its problems, not just the history of art, but also with my contemporaries. That's where I locate the sublime.
Well, you asked also about like if there's a place for it now, and I was thinking about this earlier with the discussion with Udi about this and like the kind of geopolitical nature that Orion was working in, and a lot of those land artists in the United States kind of lines up with the race to the moon sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's something that's a little bit lost now, because like, you know, NASA's pretty much being essentially defunded for the most part. Like no one really cares about going to the moon. Everyone cares about individuality at the moment, it seems like. And I feel like a lot of art has kind of gone in that same route. I don't know many people, aside from Andrea Patel, currently living that sort of lifestyle, living in the desert, for example, and like kind of doing this other. Everybody wants to be in this, you know, gallery situation, which is kind of like the most un-utopian way to do that thing, because you're always limited by scale. To make this, you never do that in the gallery. It doesn't really work that way. It doesn't translate properly. So I think, I don't know if we will get to that point again now. Like, you know, I feel like everything is kind of shifting in another way. Everyone's kind of like, it's kind of like maybe the Boston thing. You know, like the government is like on top of you, and everyone's kind of in the boiler room trying to figure out how to navigate this thing. And like,
That's great.
you know, you're just in a little basement making your thing.
Well, I think like the moon landing was, what was beautiful about it and what was sublime about it was that all of humanity supposedly was united through the medium of television in watching this first. This,
Yeah.
you know, walking on the moon is incredible. It had this idiotic aspect, I think, of like planning the American, like as if the moon is like now American territory. That seems like the worst. But also, what was amazing is now mundane. I mean, we are all interconnected through these crappy smartphones that we all share. So the idea of humanity being united in some common experience has kind of been dissolved into something mundane and frustrating and absurd. So I think that's one problem.
Yeah.
Okay. On that happy note that maybe we have to run to the basement until it's 2020. I want to thank all of our speakers that have joined us today. This was illuminating and fantastic to hear you all talk about your work. And I think we all earned our glass of wine upstairs in the gallery. You can take the elevator up to the 3rd floor. And I was told there's some bar mitzvah music in the background, so just follow the music. This is a Jewish institution, after all. And just join us for the opening reception. Thank you guys so much for being here.